Hello everyone, how are you all? I hope everyone is keeping fine and safe. So let's start our video today. Today in this video, we are going to have a discussion about laws of tort. In the previous video, we have already discussed the laws of tort and what does that signify, the various cases through which it has been derived. And in this particular video, today we are going to discuss the legal principles of the laws of tort. So there are various innumerable principles actually, so you have to remember all of them. We start with legal principle number one. Legal principle one, injura sine damnum. Injury, which means injury, a violation of legal right without damage. The next we have is legal principle two. This means any direct physical interference with goods in somebody's possession without lawful justification is called trespass of goods. Moving on to legal principle 3, a man would be responsible for all direct consequences of his act insofar as he could reasonably foresee them as arising from his act. Legal principle 4, when anyone uses his property in such a way, a manner as to cause damage, he commits the wrongful act of private nuisance. Legal principle 5, violation of legal rights with or without damage gives rise to a tort. Legal principle 6, a parent is not liable for a tort committed by his or her child except when the parent affords the child an opportunity to commit the tort. Moving on to legal principle 7, whoever uses force without any lawful justification commits battery. Legal principle 8, a minor is not competent to enter into a contract and the law will assume that the contract never happened and everything will be restored to its original position. Legal principle 9, a master shall be responsible for the wrongful acts of his servants in the course of his employment. Legal principle 10, interfering with another's goods in such a way as to deny the latter's title to the goods amounts to conversion. It is a civil wrong. Moving to legal principle 11. Nobody shall make use of his property in such a way as to cause damage to others. Any such use constitutes private nuisance, a wrongful act under law of torts. So this is in relation to property. Legal principle 12. One has to compensate another for the injury caused due to his wrongful act. The liability to compensate is reduced to the extent the latter has contributed to the injury through his own negligence. This is underlying principle of contributory negligence. Moving on to legal principle 13. This says a person is entitled to protect his property by using lawful means. Legal principle 14. A person who commits an unlawful act towards another, which can be imputed to him, must repair the damage which the other person suffers as a consequence thereof. Legal principle 15. Contractual liability is completely irrelevant to the existence of liability in tort, that is civil law. Moving on to legal principle number 16. The standard to determine whether the person has been guilty of negligence is the standard of care which, in the given circumstances, a reasonable man would have posted. Moving on to legal principle 17. A person is liable for all the injuries consequences for his of his careless act. Moving on to legal principle 18. With the 18 says, a citizen is expected to take reasonable duty of care while driving on the road and not to cause injury to any person. Legal principle 19. Contributory negligence is an accident is a defense to a charge in criminal law. Legal principle 20. A master will be liable for the wrongful acts of his servants in the course of employment. Legal principle 21. The rule of violenti non fit injuria means voluntarily suffered injury is not fit for action. Legal principle 22. Qui fecit for alium fecit for si, which means he who does an act through another is deemed in law to do it himself. He who does an act through another is deemed in law to do it himself. Legal principle 23. An assault is an attempt to do a corporeal hurt to another, coupled with an apparent present ability and intention to do the act. Battery is the intentional and direct application of any physical force to the person of another. Moving to legal principle 24. False imprisonment is a total restraint of the liberty of a person for however a short time without lawful excuse. Moving to legal principle 25. A libel is a publication of a false and defamatory statement tending to injure the reputation of another person without lawful justification or excuse. A slander is a false and defamatory statement by spoken words or gestures tending to injure the reputation of another. Moving on to legal principle 26. A master is liable for the acts of a servant as long as he can control the working of his servant. Moving on to legal principle 27. A master is liable to third persons for every such wrong of a servant as committed in the course of the service. For acts committed beyond the scope of employment, the master is liable only if he has expressly authorized the act, or else not. Moving to legal principle 28. A person is liable for any damage which is direct consequence of his or her unlawful act, as long as the consequence could have been foreseen by a reasonable person. Moving on to legal principle 29. The owner of a land is entitled to the column of airspace above the surface ad infinitum, but the right is restricted to such height as is necessary for the ordinary use and employment of his land and structure on it. Moving on to legal principle 30. Trespass to land is a wrongful and unwarranted entry upon the land of another. Moving on to legal principle number 31. Negligence is the breach of a duty caused by an omission to do something which a reasonable person would do, or an act which a prudent and a reasonable person would not do. An action for negligence proceeds upon the principle that the person has an obligation or duty on the part of the defendant which he or she breaches, leading to damage. The next is legal principle number 32. An occupier is not normally liable to a trespasser except in respect of willful act intended to cause him harm or done with reckless disregard. Legal principle number 33. A master will be liable for the wrongful acts of a servant in the course of employment. Moving to legal principle number 34. The occupier of a premises owes a duty to care to all his invitees and visitors. Legal principle 35. One has to compensate another for the injury caused due to his wrongful act. The liability to compensate is reduced to the extent the latter has contributed to the injury through his own negligence. This is an underlying principle of contributory negligence. The next is legal principle 36. Negligence is the omission to do something which a reasonable man would do, breach of which, if it causes damage, makes one liable to the person who suffered loss. Moving to legal principle 37. One owes a duty of care to another if a responsible man can foresee that he will be affected by the breach of duty. Moving to legal principle 38. A person cannot complain against a harm to which he has voluntarily consented. Precautions can be taken only against reasonable foreseeable mishaps. The next is legal principle 39. No legal remedy exists for an injury caused by an act for which one has consented. Legal principle 40. Damages cannot be claimed against a risk to which consent has been given. The principle does not apply to such cases. Now, moving to legal principle 41. A person is entitled to use reasonable force for self-defense. Legal principle 42. Where the owner of a vehicle, being himself in possession and occupation of it, requests or allows another person to drive, the owner is liable as principal for damage caused by the person actually driving. The next is legal principle 43. An employee shall be liable to the injuries caused by his employee by the negligence of a fellow employee in the course of employment. Moving to legal principle 44. The husband or wife is not responsible for any compensation or wrong on each other. Legal principle 45. However, the master is not liable if the wrongful act was committed by the servant who has no connection whatsoever with the servant's contract of employment. The next is legal principle 46. If a person, by an act, lowers the reputation of another in the eye of right-thinking people, then the person who suffered a loss of reputation can sue for damages. Legal principle 47. The state is liable for the act of its employees when the act is of private nature in the same manner and under the same condition as of another employer. The state is not liable when the act is in the exercise of sovereign power or in the performance of an act of the state. Moving on to legal principle 48. Even if the sovereign functions of the state are discharged negligently, the state is not vicariously liable in tort. Legal principle 49. When an offense is committed by a company, every person who at the time when the offences was committed, was responsible for the conduct of the business of the company, shall be deemed to be guilty of the offence and shall be liable for punishment. Moving on to legal principle 50. According to the doctrine of vicarious liability, a person shall be liable for the damage caused by his employee in the course of employment. Moving on to legal principle 51. Whoever stores a substance which would cause damage on escape shall be strictly liable. That is, liable even when he has exercised necessary care for any damage caused by the escape of that substance. Moving on to legal principle 52. A person intentionally causing harm to others is liable for a battery. A person is said to have intended an harm in so far as he brings about the harm purposely or knowingly. Moving on to legal principle 53. A person defames another if he states anything which exposes the other to hatred or ridicule or results in him being shunned by others or injures him in his trade, business, or profession. Moving to legal principle 54. To commit the offense of defamation, there must be communication of defamatory statement to a third party. Moving to legal principle 55. A doctor is to keep the information given by the patient in strict confidence and cannot provide the information to any party. Moving to legal principle 56. Information in public interest cannot be withheld. That means it cannot be kept a secret. Moving to legal principle 57. Everyone is under a legal obligation to take reasonable care to avoid commission or omission which he can foresee would injure his neighbor. The neighbor for this purpose is any person whom he should have in his mind as likely to be affected by his act. Moving to legal principle 58. In order to succeed in an action for damages, the person who files the case must prove that the defendant is at fault. Moving to legal principle 59. However, if the factors which caused the accident were in the normal course of the defendant, and if the accident is of such a nature that it would not have happened in normal course, then the law presumes fault on the part of the persons who had control of the factors that caused the accident. Moving to legal principle 60. Everybody is under a legal obligation to take reasonable care to avoid commission or omission which he can foresee would injure his neighbor. The neighbor for this purpose be any person whom he should have in his mind as likely to be affected by this act. Moving to legal principle 61. A careless person becomes liable for his negligence when he owed a duty of care to others. Moving to legal principle 62. As a person is liable for any harm caused by his activity only to the extent he could have foreseen their damage. Moving to legal principle 63. The last opportunity rule fixes the liability on the person who had the last opportunity of avoiding an accident by taking ordinary care. Legal principle 64. Unlawful interference with a person's use or enjoyment of his premises is a civil wrong and forbidden by law. Moving to legal principle 65. Nobody shall unlawfully interfere with a person's use or enjoyment of her land or some right over or in connection with it. The use of enjoyment should be normal and reasonable, taking into account the situation prevailing in the surrounding locality. Moving to legal principle 66. Nobody shall make use of his property in such a way as to cause damage to others. Any such use constitutes private nuisance, a wrongful act under law of torts. Moving to legal principle 67. One has to compensate another for the injury caused to his wrongful act. The liability to compensate is reduced to the extent the latter has contributed to the injury through his own negligence. This is the underlying principle of contributory negligence. The last legal principle we have in line is legal principle 68. A person is liable for the consequence of his wrongful act only to the extent he can foresee the consequences of his act. So these are all the legal principles that we have been discussing in relating to the torts, that is legal principles of law of torts. So there are various principles, 68 in number. Do remember them, and I'm sure you have heard the video and this has proved of great value to you. So do refer to the other videos, the previous ones that have been made relating to other series of law of torts, and definitely you'll find value out of it. So thank you for hearing me out patiently, and all the best for your future. Thank you.